Hello again. On August the 2nd, 1990, so almost exactly 30 years ago, Iraq sent a portion of its army to occupy its tiny southeastern neighbor, the oil rich Emirate of Kuwait, which it did in a matter of hours. This then prompted the US president at the time, George Bush Sr., to deploy in the autumn of 1990 thousands of US forces in Saudi Arabia, both to protect that country from a possible Iraqi invasion and, of course, to prepare for an eventual retaking of Kuwait and an invasion of Iraq in order to force Saddam Hussein to give up Kuwait. Ostensibly, Saddam Hussein sent his forces there because of an alleged border dispute, but in practice, he was in a desperate need for money. And since Kuwait happened to be an oil rich and militarily weak country, it was easy for him to satisfy his immediate need for money by occupying Kuwait. So, why this need for money? Because of the nearly 8-year stalemated war between Iraq and Iran, which had ended in a UN brokered ceasefire in August 1988, having begun in September 1980. Saddam Hussein, since officially becoming the president of Iraq in 1979, had brutally oppressed his people, including the Kurdish minority, but not only them, also fellow Muslims, which of course showed that not all Muslims are the same, certainly not. Even by the Middle Eastern, was also at least as brutal dictator. However, in the 1980s, when the stalemated Iraq-Iran war was going on, the United States and some other Western countries had, fearful of the Islamic Revolution spread westward from Iran, nevertheless decided to support Iraq as the lesser of two evils. In other words, for example, the United States had engaged in opportunism in its foreign policy. So it seemed kind of inconsistent or even hypocritical for President Bush and other administration officials to paint it in rather apocalyptic terms that peace was at stake and this brutal dictator had to be stopped. Well, the United States technically could have stopped him already earlier if it really had wanted to. And the United States did not take certain intelligence reports about the impending invasion and occupation of Kuwait seriously enough, quickly enough. So this then led to the so-called Desert Shield. Troops from the United States and many other countries were shipped or then transported by air or land to northern Saudi Arabia, to the Iraqi-Saudi border, and then eventually they would invade Iraq and Kuwait in January and February 1991, causing the so-called, or putting into place the so-called Gulf War, the first Persian Gulf War. The second one in 2003 was fought between a US-led coalition and Iraq itself to depose Saddam Hussein. That was successful. So let's look at the events, how they unfolded. In early 1990, Iraq was accusing Kuwait of stealing Iraqi petroleum through slant drilling, although some Iraqi sources indicated that the dictator Saddam Hussein's decision to attack Kuwait was made a few months before the actual invasion. Some felt there were several reasons for the Iraqi move, including Iraq's inability to pay the more than 14 billion US dollars of that time that it had borrowed to finance the Iran-Iraq war, and Kuwaiti high petroleum production levels, which kept revenues down for Iraq. So the invasion started on August the 2nd, 1990, and within 2 days, most of the Kuwaiti armed forces were either overrun by the Iraqi Republican Guard or fell back to the neighboring Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Iraq set up a puppet government known as the Republic of Kuwait to rule over Kuwait, and then annexed it outright when Saddam Hussein announced a few days later that it was the 19th province of Iraq. According to Wikipedia, 88,000 Iraqi troops participated in the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, against a total of 20,000 Kuwaiti troops. 295 Iraqis and 420 Kuwaitis were killed. 361 Iraqis were wounded, while 12,000 Kuwaitis were captured. 120 tanks and armored vehicles were destroyed on the Iraqi side, while on the Kuwaiti side, about 250 tanks were destroyed and captured, and 850 plus armored vehicles were destroyed and captured. In terms of the air forces, Battle 39 Iraqi airplanes and 57 Kuwaiti ones were destroyed. 4 ships were sunk on the Iraqi side, 17 on the Kuwaiti side. Many Westerners believe that Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was largely motivated by its desire to take control over the latter's vast oil reserves. The Iraqi government justified its invasion by claiming that Kuwait was a natural part of Iraq carved off as a result of British imperialism. After signing the British Ottoman Convention of 1913, Britain had planned to split Kuwait from the Ottoman territories into a separate sheikhdom, but this agreement was never ratified. The Iraqi government also claimed that many ordinary Kuwaitis opposed their ruler, the Kuwaiti emir. By overthrowing the emir, Iraq claimed that it granted Kuwaitis greater economic and political freedom. Kuwait had been loosely under the authority of the Ottoman Vilayet of Basra, and although its ruling dynasty, the Al Sabah family, had concluded a protectorate agreement in 1899 that assigned responsibility for its foreign affairs to Britain, it did not make any attempt to break away from the Ottoman Empire. And for this reason, its borders with the rest of Basra province remained unclear. On July the 25th, 1990, so just 8 days before the invasion, April Glaspie, who was then the US ambassador to Iraq, asked the Iraqi High Command to explain the military preparations in progress, including the massing of Iraqi troops near the Iraqi-Kuwaiti border. The US ambassador Glaspie declared to her Iraqi interlocutor that Washington, inspired by the friendship and not by confrontation, does not have an opinion on the disagreement between Kuwait and Iraq, stating, "We have no opinion on the Arab conflicts." Glaspie also indicated to Saddam Hussein that the United States did not intend to start an economic war against Iraq. We, of course, know what happened later in 1990. Sanctions were imposed, and eventually in January 1991, the first Persian Gulf War was started by the US-led coalition. These statements, whether they were made in sincere faith, or whether they were made to please Saddam Hussein, whether they were based on a sober examination of the facts or not, we don't know for sure, possibly caused Hussein to believe that he had received a diplomatic green light from the United States to invade and occupy Kuwait. This exchange only became public in 2011 following a WikiLeaks release of a cable sent by the US Embassy in Iraq following on from Ms. Glaspie's meeting with President Hussein. In addition, 1 week before the invasion, the Assistant Secretary of State or Foreign Minister John Kelly told the US Congress that the US had no treaty obligations to defend Kuwait. According to Richard E. Rubenstein, Glaspie was later asked by British journalists why she had made those remarks, and she had replied, "We didn't think he would go that far," meaning invade and annex the whole Kuwait. So it can be inferred that the US federal government thought in July 1990, just before the invasion and occupation of Kuwait, that Saddam Hussein only wanted to pressure Kuwait into debt forgiveness and to lower oil production. However, on August the 2nd, 1990, at 2 o'clock in the morning, local time, Saddam Hussein ordered Iraq to launch an invasion of Kuwait with 4 elite Iraqi Republican Guard divisions and Iraqi Army Special Forces units equivalent to a full division, deployed by helicopters and boats to attack Kuwait City, while other divisions seized the airports and 2 air bases. Despite months of Iraqi saber rattling, Kuwait clearly did not expect an invasion. Therefore, its army was not alerted. Despite that, the Kuwaiti air, ground, and naval forces did put up resistance. In central Kuwait, the 35th Armored Brigade deployed approximately a battalion of chieftain tanks, BMPs, and an artillery battery against the Iraqis and fought delaying actions near Al-Jara, west of Kuwait City. In the south, the 15th Armored Brigade immediately evacuated its forces to Saudi Arabia. The Kuwaiti Air Force's airplanes put up a valiant resistance, albeit a brief one. A few combat sorties or attacks were flown against Iraqi ground forces. Approximately 20% of Kuwaiti airplanes, military airplanes, were lost or captured. The remaining 80% were then evacuated to Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Iraqi troops attacked Dasman Palace, the royal residence, resulting in the Battle of Dasman Palace. The Kuwaiti emir was able to escape, however. His younger half-brother, Sheikh Fahad al-Ahmed al-Jaber al-Sabah, was shot and killed by invading Iraqi forces as he attempted to defend Dasman Palace, after which his body was placed in front of a tank and run over. So the emir may have received some really quick advance warning, Jaber al-Ahmad al-Jaber al-Sabah, because he had already fled into the Saudi Arabian desert. Kuwaitis founded a local armed resistance movement following the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait. Most of the Kuwaitis who were arrested, tortured, and executed during the occupation were civilians. 400,000 Kuwaiti citizens fled or left the country after the invasion, and a network of safe houses was established for those who remained and joined the resistance. Eventually, in the autumn of 1990, President Bush declared that the deployment of US forces into Saudi Arabia was necessary to preserve our very way of life. I can remember reading a critical book. I unfortunately can't remember its name anymore, where the author stated bluntly that President Bush could have said it more directly, that these American troops went to the Persian Gulf for oil, on which the very American way of life so greatly depends. But they concluded resignedly, or perhaps even rather cynically, yet reminding Americans of their well-known addiction is not good politics, nor is asking them to die for it. Of course, even more was at stake than just the US access to oil. Yes, there was some sincere desire to defend democracy, but we have to remember that the same administration officials just days earlier had not taken seriously the intelligence reports. At least one had, according to this book, whose title I've forgotten, been relayed either to Ambassador Glaspie or even to another administration official, Kuwait. Because, I mean, as the authors of that book, published almost 30 years ago, put it bluntly, um, the supply of oil in readily available amounts and at relatively low and steady prices had been a mainstay or main part of the US foreign policy after the Second World War, which unfortunately was true. And they advocated increased energy conservation and indirectly the adoption of alternative sources of energy.